Secretary, thank you for being with us. And before I get started with some questions, I just want to congratulate Secretary Ross, the President, for a great quarter of GDP growth. So congratulations to you and the economic team. We're looking forward to a lot of those.
Thank you.
So getting on with Indo-Pacific, it features prominently in the President's national security strategy. From a strategic logic, what is the rationale for Indo-Pacific from a commercial point of view?
Well, Indo-Pacific as an important region actually goes back to 1794. State Department opened a branch, a location in Calcutta. So that's how far back it goes. But relationships have gone up and down in between. It was part of the NSC, National Security Plan, in 2017 that President Trump announced in Da Nang, Vietnam. So that's really what has kicked off the tremendous momentum that we have now underway. From a commercial point of view, there are all sorts of reasons for it. We import from the region about $1 trillion, and we export to it around $450 billion. That trade deficit of $550 is an issue, but the total volume is also very, very important. And of that trade deficit, China is about $376 billion. So the vast bulk of it is with China. Those exports to the region support some 550,000 jobs in the U.S. 40,000 U.S. companies sell over 100 billion of products to the Indo-Pacific region. So it's a very, very important economic factor for us. Exports to the region grew by 10% last year, which is a pretty good performance for any region. And perhaps most importantly of all, the Brookings Institution believes that of the next billion people to come into middle-class economic status, 88% will be in the Indo-Pacific region. So that's a pretty staggering statistic from a consumer consumption point of view.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think Secretary Pompeo was saying it's the largest and the fastest growing, so pretty special. So many of us in the business community had quite a bit of anxiety when we pulled out of TPP and were left with 3 trade agreements in the area, in the region. Does this commercial strategy, this part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, does that substitute for what would have been TPP? Is there another way of thinking about our commercial strategy going forward?
Well, when we withdrew from TPP, we withdrew from a potential agreement with which we disagreed. It was not a withdrawal from the region. To the contrary, one of Vice President Pence's first trips, which I had the honor of accompanying him on, was to Japan. And he then went on to other countries. I went on to Thailand, to Laos, to a whole bunch of countries. So people should not misinterpret withdrawal from a particular potential agreement as withdrawal from a region. Nothing could be further from the truth. And you've seen the President was in Da Nang for the ASEAN conference. Everybody has been out there a lot. Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. So if anything, there's much more intensified diplomatic, military, and commercial activity than there ever has been.
Do you worry about RCEP, the so-called ASEAN +3 or ASEAN +4, and then Japan and the EU that people are moving forward. Is that a concern? Does that put any, is there an implication to how fast we move, given that others are moving as well?
Well, at the end of the day, our relationships tend to end up being bilateral. And we have indicated, President has indicated on many occasions, a willingness to enter into more agreements with countries in the region. So it's a question of format rather than a question of desire or substance.
So you would see more bilaterals?
I think so. It's not
place.
inconceivable that we could end up in some multilaterals. President's concern about multilaterals is severalfold. One, they take forever to do. You're well aware of that from your history as Secretary of Commerce. Second, they're very, very complicated because you have to make a concession to this individual country to get what you want from it in the agreement. Then you go to the next country, they want a different concession. Now you've been nicked twice, and each one gets the benefit of the deal negotiated by the other one. You go through 10 or 12 of these, and you're pretty well nicked up. So that's one concern we have. The other one, which is related to the duration of the negotiations, is if you've been working on something for 6 years, 8 years, and it now comes down to a couple of really big issues at the very end, do you really want to walk away from the agreement and go back to your loved one and say, you know, dear, I just blew 8 years of my life and came away empty? There's a kind of deal fatigue that can set in that doesn't necessarily result in an optimal deal. So those are some of the concerns that we have. But he has not taken them totally off the table. It's just we think it's easier and faster, perhaps, to do bilaterals.
The Doha round of WTO is a good example of just trying to bring 140 countries together, and pretty difficult. So I think the business community and most people in the audience agree that we have to do something about commercial practices, business practices in China. There's concern about how we're going about it. There's some concern about price increases, cost increases, potential impact to U.S. companies doing business in China, unintended consequences. You've heard all of that. How do you see this ending? How do you see this evolving? I think everybody would like to see it go away and fix the problem. And
well, we well understand that fear of the unknown is the worst fear of all. Business hates uncertainty. Business can adapt to good news. Business can adapt to bad news. Uncertainty is hard for it to deal with. So we understand that. On the other hand, it is our very strong feeling that the abuses are too severe, are unaffordable, and cannot continue forever. So the real question in our mind is, what is the best way to try to deal with the abuses of which everybody in this room is quite well aware? And our conclusion was that one had to take a very aggressive stance, and that if you were ever going to take an aggressive stance, that clearly the right time to do it is when your economy is really strong, when we are at pretty much close to full employment, when the GDP numbers were just the 4.1% that you mentioned. If you ever have to get into some sort of a spat with someone, that's the right environment within which to do it, because there's more ability for the economy to absorb whatever short-term problems may come. I liken it a little bit to going on a diet. It's no fun in the very beginning, gets maybe a little bit painful, but at the end of the day, you're kind of happy with the end result. We think that's the way this will evolve, and that it ultimately will come down to negotiations. Will we get everything we want? Probably not. Will we make a lot more progress than has been made in the prior decades? We're quite convinced we will, because at the end of the day, it's not in anyone's interest to have this go on for 100,000 years.
Yeah, for sure. And the idea is to get a deal with NAFTA, get the EU issues resolved so that the focus is China.
Right. Well, there are lots of focuses, but our immediate, most close to completion negotiations are with NAFTA, particularly with Mexico. We're very pleased that the new president in Mexico wasted no time at all in appointing his new trade team, which is a combination of the old team and new people. Right. And he didn't wait until his inauguration, which will not be until December 1st. He did it within the first couple of days after the election. That speaks to, and his rhetoric has become pretty constructive, as has the rhetoric of his team. So we think there's a pretty good chance that we could be on a pretty rapid track with the Mexican talks. And there are fewer issues with Canada. So yeah. Mexico is intellectually the more complicated of the two. So if we can solve that, we should be able to fill in with Canada.
Great. Good news. Thank you. So there's been a lot of talk and excitement, I would say, given the president's energy reform and the production that we have in the U.S. and the unconventional methods that we're using to produce oil and gas. A lot of excitement about the potential to export to Indo-Pacific. Is the infrastructure really there? Is there something we have to do first to actually get to the point where, you know, a lot of money is flowing from the east to the west because we've got the energy?
Right. Well, I frankly hate it when they call it unconventional. The shale phenomenon is becoming quite conventional and is quite sophisticated and quite well developed. And my guess is we'll find even more efficiencies as we go forward. I believe Secretary Perry is going to be here later, so I don't want to steal his thunder. But the main reason why I think there aren't even bigger exports right now is the prior administration have been very, very slow on granting export licenses. You need licensing to get to countries with whom you do not have free trade agreements. Right. And since we have so few, particularly in this region, that's been a real handicap. So that's one problem. There's no lack of capital in the U.S. for expanding the LNG export facilities. That's going ahead pretty well. A lot of capital devoted to it. There is capital needed for the regasification facilities at the other end, and those are coming along pretty well as well. So I think both to Indo-Pacific and also as to Europe, there are very, very strong prospects for LNG. And that's one of the best ways to reduce our deficit is to fill a need that the countries already have, as opposed to struggling over things that are extremely competitive. Truth is, Indo-Pacific does not have the hydrocarbon resources that it needs to sustain its growth rates. And we are the very logical provider, maybe the most logical provider of that. So there's no reason that won't help a lot to reduce the trade deficit.
Absolutely. So the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India are being viewed as the Quad, and a lot of similarities across the countries, democracies, and but they are different countries, and they often disagree, and they don't see things in a similar fashion. Are you doing anything, Commerce Department, to align the group a little bit more? And what does the Quad mean for U.S. business? And will that make it easier? Will it facilitate doing business in these four countries or in these three countries?
Well, we think so. For example, in infrastructure, Australia, Japan, and ourselves have joined forces in a very big infrastructure financing activity. The Japanese Bank for International Development has already committed some $26 billion to the project. You'll have here later today Ray Washburn from OPIC, and he'll explain to you